Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staying. My name is Todd Rossnagel. I'm Director of Communications for the Louisiana Conference, and we want to welcome you back to this important series, important conversations for an important time here inside the United Methodist Church, and specifically inside the United Methodist Church and the Louisiana Conference. Joining us for this particular episode is, as always, our co-host for this entire series, Van Stinson. Van, thank you so much again for joining us.
It's good to be here again.
It's always good to see you. And our special guest for this particular episode is Katrena King. She is the ministry intern at First Church Lafayette. So we thank her for driving over from Lafayette. The second time now that we've had someone drive over from Lafayette and drove through rain. Does it always rain when you drive from Lafayette to Baton Rouge?
Not every time, but I always feel like I tell my husband, it always rains on this road.
It does. It seems that way. We're in that time of year. So Katrena, welcome to the show here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us. And you are also, for purposes of our conversation and for our audience at home, you're enrolled in seminary. You are in the process, as they say, to be a deacon. Tell the folks at home what you're doing.
That's correct. I have been taking one class a year at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary out of Chicago, and I have 2 classes left before I could potentially be commissioned.
Well, congratulations on that. I know what it feels like to have a few classes left, which is a good thing. I think that would be my first question. We were talking, Van and I have talked about, in one of my first episodes with you, Van, you talked about where do you see hope?
Sure.
And remind us where you see hope, and that is in people like Katrena.
Absolutely, that in this current context of division and misinformation, that there's still people responding to the call of God to go into, follow licensing or go off to seminary, and there's still lay people who are finding a faith home in the United Methodist Church, even in the midst of all of this. And I see those signs of hope, and I see signs of hope in you, and the way you've responded to your call, having grown up in this conference. And I've served with your dad for a number of years now as a clergy colleague, and it's just it's a real symbol of a fruitful future to see you here sitting at this table. So yeah.
So Katrena, with everything that's going on with the denomination and the future, why raise your hand for ministry?
Well, I'll tell you, it wasn't always easy. I kind of came into this process kicking and screaming, for lack of better words. I spent some time growing up in the church my whole life, moving around as a pastor's kid. Mm-hmm. And when I got to college, I kind of took a step away and was like, I just need some space.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was halfway through law school and also at the same time had joined the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women as a board member that I realized something was missing in my life, and I was looking for that something. And really, it came from other people telling me that they saw something in me. And had I ever thought about ministry? And I said, absolutely not. No way. I don't want to do that. And then it was more, when are you coming over to the dark side? And I was like, never, ever, 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 ever. And then a couple of years into it, suddenly I was in the process and finding my way as I moved along. So it wasn't easy, but I took a lot of time and discernment to realize that I was being called to be in a place of holding space for other people during difficult times. And that was before we really got into the thick of things with all of this denominational strife.
So, and yet, in the midst of all of that, you continue to enroll and continue to go through the process. And I'm assuming that's because in the midst of all of this is a question I usually ask at the end, but I'll ask it now. Where do you see hope?
I see hope in working together with other people. There's a lot of work before us, and there are things that are happening that just need to continue to be done every single day. And we can't get wrapped up in the higher level of everything when we have to be the boots on the ground sometimes. So part of the participation with helping others continue the work on the ground in the communities, in our churches, moving forward.
Van, that answer reminds me of an answer that we talked about with Carly, which is, you don't have to do anything. Churches don't have to have a vote right now.
Right.
But the one thing that they do need to be doing is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation
Be faithful
of the world.
to the mission. And, you just alluded to that, I think, which is so beautiful. The vast majority of folks are just out there living their life, trying to be faithful followers of Jesus. And yeah, all this stuff is going on, and it's important stuff, but it pales in comparison to that fundamental message of discipleship, which is, come, go, serve, love, be my people in the world. So yeah, grassroots, ground level. That's what it's all about in the midst of this.
I've heard you say from time to time, blocking and tackling.
Yeah.
Tell the folks at home what you mean by that sometimes.
Well, we were talking about how we go out and recruit clergy because we have, as we've stated in other circles, a shortage of clergy, and we're experiencing this even despite people answering the call. There's still more retiring than there are folks coming into the system. But when you start talking about what are the basics of ministry that you need to have in place beyond a theological education, or it's the basics. It's blocking and tackling. It's just that sort of using a football metaphor there. You got to cover those basics, or however many plays you have and how many yards you gain. Really, it doesn't matter. And I think that's a lesson for us in the church too. Loving God and loving neighbor. In some ways, it all boils down to the beauty and the demand of that.
Yeah. Katrena, I wanted to maybe unpack a little bit more about seminary, because you're speaking to us as someone enrolled in a seminary, and there is a lot of conversation right now about our seminaries. And, the misnomer that, we have all of these progressive seminaries out there that are just cranking out progressive left-leaning pastors that are going to be fast-tracked into the system. And before you know it, we're going to have a bunch of left-leaning pastors in the system. And by the way, I apologize for the gagillionth time for using left, right, center left language. It is what it is at this point. But talk to me a little bit about what it's like to be inside a seminary class, and what are your seminary professors what is a seminary education designing you for into the real world?
It's funny because it's kind of what I already alluded to, the boots on the ground work. Mm-hmm. It's about creating relationships with people and helping them through the process of finding God and connecting with one another to do good work. And seminary is an interesting place because there are people there from all life experiences, all denominations, and then I find myself in United Methodist classes as well, and people that aren't United Methodist taking United Methodist classes to learn all kinds of things.
Who is this guy, John Wesley, right?
Right, exactly. And why does it matter? And then for some reason, we always end up on the same page of, like you said, loving God and loving neighbor and carrying out the works of the world together.
Yeah, that ecumenical nature of a seminary education, I think, is really important. So while I ask the question of kind of labels, where would you be comfortable kind of describing yourself? Center right, center left?
I think I'd say center left, but holding the tension on both sides.
Unpack that a bit for me. What does that mean, holding the tension?
Well, I think it's creating space for everybody to be heard. I find a lot of times people feel misunderstood because they aren't able to share how they feel, because it's not easy to unpack these conversations. They're very complex, and we're dealing with people here. And so I feel like one of my secret superpowers is kind of holding space to have conversations that are difficult and be a little vulnerable and talk about the harm on all sides that might be taking place and how we can work through it together.
So teasing this out a bit more, and I know from someone who also has spent time at Garrett in my own past, I know that there are people that you disagree with in your classes, and I know there are probably pastors in this system that you disagree with, specifically on this particular issue that is causing so much division and strife right now. How do you do that? How do you have respect for another person who you might have drastically different viewpoints?
I think it's knowing that we all come from different life experiences and that there are different things that mold us and form us throughout the process of life, and that there are reasons why we make decisions on stances that we take. And I think it has to do with the people we know and the things we've done. And sometimes those lead us in directions that we might regret later. I've certainly done things or thought things that I regretted in the past, and I've eventually grown better for it. And so maybe meeting people where they are in the process, whether they're struggling or they can easily say, this is what I believe, like I want to be part of that conversation and be there with them to hear what it is.
Van, how important is it for all of us, not just Katrena and not just those at First in Lafayette who she is ministering with, but for all of us, including those who are even going through the discernment process as congregations, to hold that tension? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that holding the tension is one of the essentials of the Wesleyan tradition.
How so?
John Wesley was a person of one book, as he said. He was a man of the Scriptures, an Anglican priest, and yet was a student of the Scriptures, a teacher of the Scriptures, and yet his experience led him to preach and teach and go down ways to further the gospel that oftentimes put him at odds with his own institution and his own establishment. So he held that tension, and I think in some ways the Wesleyan tradition, it's both evangelical with a big E, or little
Sure.
E, whichever one is supposed to be, but broadly understood, and Catholic, holds that tension between those two. Student of the Scripture, and yet highly liturgical, and we hold those in tension with one another. And I think the beauty of our tradition, and I think particularly in the Louisiana Conference, is that we have always been able to hold a generous orthodoxy and an extreme center that folks on all sides of issues have come together, and not that those issues weren't important issues, but they were secondary issues to the primary goal of furthering the mission and being the living reminders of Jesus Christ in our communities and in our conference. And we in Louisiana have always, I think, held that as a high priority. And so that tension has always, I think, drawn us closer to one another.
Sure.
Unfortunately now, with the current climate, that tension is oftentimes pulling us away from one another, yet we must always strive to hold that tension, because that's who we are as followers of John Wesley.
Katrena, in a previous life, and you are a young person, so to say in a previous life is saying something, but in a previous life, you were an attorney, you were a lawyer. How has that experience as a lawyer helped you in this process, especially going forward into the future?
I think in my practice as an attorney, it helped me realize that I need to be able to have conversations with all types of people and kind of meet on the same page, meet in the middle. Sometimes we compromise, sometimes we walk away, and all of those things have a time and a place. And so being able to speak to different people, even when the conversations are difficult, even when you're arguing point to point, it finds something about the process that is beautiful when you can all come to a resolution together.
As a ministry intern, someone who is learning the process of what it means to be ministering in the local parish, what has been your experience in talking to people, and what are you hearing there in Lafayette and the people inside that congregation about where the denomination is this getting as much chatter and conversation as we're hearing? I'd be curious as to what you're hearing on the ground.
Yes and no. I think I'm tapped into a lot of different places because of my service at both the denominational level and the local level in the local church. But people in my local congregation maybe aren't talking about it as much as people might imagine. And if they are, they're asking for points of clarity. They need to understand a little bit more about what's going on. But then, in other churches in the area, in family members' churches, things like that, people are asking different questions. It kind of just depends on what they're hearing and from where. So there's some confusion going on, and I think having guidance from a higher level would be helpful to just point out what exactly is happening, what has not happened yet, what might happen one day, and when do we need to make decisions? And right now, I think people might be feeling rushed to do things, and they don't particularly know the impact of what those actions are yet, because we don't honestly know yet.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. And I think it's important. This is part of the reason why we're doing this series, is that we want to try and educate and dispel some of the misinformation that's out there, but yet also at the same time point to a future that we feel is bright inside the United Methodist Church. Van, as you hear kind of what's happening on the local ground, sometimes I think for those of us who work inside the building here at 527 North, think that every single United Methodist is concerned about some of these matters, and the reality is that they're not, and that might be a good thing. That might mean that they're doing the work of discipling.
Well, I would much rather hear about people who are busy doing the work of transformation in their own lives and in their communities than, questioning now, what was that video about that, somebody referenced? So anyway, from whomever, But yeah, it goes back to the blocking and tackling. Ultimately, what happens with the United Methodist Church is far less important than what happens to the good news of the gospel going forward. And I think it's always good. We do a lot of institutional navel gazing. We take ourselves way too seriously sometimes, and rightfully so, because that's our job, that's our responsibility. But we ought not ever lose sight of the fact that all of this should be moving us toward a more full and faithful expression of what it means to be followers of Jesus Christ today, tomorrow, and well into the future. We ought not lose sight of that.
Katrena, I know I asked you earlier for where you see hope. There have been several moments just in hearing your story where I could sense that you saw hope. You saw hope as a child, going to church every Sunday as a preacher's child. And you saw hope in college when you said you wanted to take a break, but then you came back. Mm-hmm. Can you, perhaps a bit of vulnerability here, can you unpack that, what that was like to take a break and then realize that Jesus is right there with you, welcoming you back to the faith?
Sure. I think that a lot of times we think that we know more than we do. And, especially college students think,
Sure.
I know everything there is to know.
Right.
How many sermons I've heard every Sunday. Taking a break was good because it was an opportunity to explore what else is out there. And then at the same time, feeling there was a void that I needed to come back to and fill. And I felt familiarity in the United Methodist Church. And I felt familiarity in our traditions and the things that we say and that we do as part of the United Methodist Church. And that kind of is what brought me back with a new sense of refreshment, I guess, looking at the things that I knew very well with a new set of eyes from having a new experience in life of not having those things. Sometimes the distance makes the heart grow fonder. It was really something like that. Stepping away made me miss it. And seeing a lot of new and different things in the world made me appreciate what I had experienced and why I wanted to return and continue to share that with others who needed to see that in the world.
Yeah, and Carly Pigeon was talking about in her role through the disaffiliation process, she asks congregations and churches, what will you gain from leaving the United Methodist Church, and what will you lose? And what I hear you saying is just picking up a United Methodist hymnal brought you a sense of familiarity that really was at your ethos, at your core of your spiritual being, that was really important to you.
Sure. Yeah. And being in spaces that were familiar, with people that were familiar, and then using that as a way to welcome others that aren't familiar and welcome them into that feeling.
Yeah. Van, your reflection on that.
Well, just having been, in ministry now for, going on 25 plus years, having heard that same rationale given from individuals, couples who came from very different faith traditions, no faith tradition, from a place of hurt and pain, just looking for a place to belong that celebrated who they were, reminded them that they were God's good creation, and called them to live a life that was both fulfilling and deeply meaningful to the world. So many have found that place within the United Methodist Church. And for those of us who came to it, for those of us who grew up in it and maybe, walked away and thought about it for a bit and came back, or from those who have no experience of church or religion whatsoever, but found a meaningful community where their questions,
Sure.
to our other topic of another podcast, our questions could be asked, maybe not answered, but asked,
that's okay.
and for that to be accepted and celebrated and affirmed, I have seen that in so many others. So to hear you talk about that, Katrena, it was just a reminder of one of the gifts of the United Methodist Church.
And Garrett being such a diverse campus from, you mentioned it earlier, other denominations, people from other countries, and seeing that, being amidst that diversity. I'd be curious, what do you like most about Louisiana? The Louisiana Conference. Do you see ministry as Louisiana being a fruitful place for ministry?
I do.
And what do you tell your friends in seminary? You need to come to Louisiana because obviously the food comes up, but aside from that.
Sure. I mean, people always say that we're friendly here, but I think that our culture has to do with relationship, heavily so. People come here and are welcomed, and I think that we reflect that in our church conference and in our church communities in a way that not every denomination does, and in a way that makes people curious to see what it is that's different about us and why someone like them, whoever they are, might be welcomed there.
Yeah. Katrena, thank you so much for
Yes.
making the drive over here and visiting with us. We really appreciate it. And thanks for your ministry. And best of luck with your, what did you say, two more courses? Two more courses at Garrett, and best of luck. And we look forward to the day when we can see you ordained as a deacon in the United Methodist Church.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And Van, thanks again for your time. We
Great
always
to be with
appreciate
you,
it.
Katrena. Thank you.
And we thank you at home for joining us. Remember, the comment section is open. We want to hear from you. If you'd like to leave us a comment, please do so in the YouTube chat or on Facebook or on the podcast channel of your choice, wherever that may be. We'd love to hear from you. For William Willoughby, who's producing behind the scenes, for Van Stinson, for Katrena King for this particular episode, and thanks again to all of you for joining us. I'm your host, Todd Rossnagel. Until next time, have a great day, everyone.